climate change. I am Mariam Shalshat and this is 750. On this episode of 750, here with me is the Australia's Ambassador for Climate Change, Christine Tilley. Welcome to the show. I believe this is your first time to the Maldives. How has Maldives treated you so far?
It is indeed, and thanks for having me on the show today. Look, it's my first time to the Maldives, either for business or for pleasure. I certainly want to come back for both as soon as I can. But look, I've felt like I've been treated exceptionally well. I've had lots of great discussions with some of your ministers, with community groups, with former Maldivian students who studied in Australia. So getting a really broad cross-section of views about the country, its approach to climate change, and starting to think around how the Maldives and Australia can work even more closely together on climate.
I hope you'll get to visit the Maldives sometime.
Me too.
For something other than business, yes. For sure. To start with, could you please share with us the significance of your visit to the Maldives in the context of Australia's global climate agenda?
Absolutely. We had a change of government in Australia a little bit less than 2 years ago, and that new government has come in with a very strong focus on climate change. And in particular, the new government has been spending a lot of time engaging in the Pacific, which is of course the region of the world that our country is in. And any conversation you have with Pacific Island nations, climate change is front and centre in those discussions. So unsurprisingly, in our international engagements, climate change is a key pillar upon which we seek to collaborate and build more partnerships with other countries. In addition, of course, to that strong focus in the Pacific, we look more globally as well, and increasingly we've started to look at the need to engage in the Indian Ocean region in particular. And so that's what's brought me here to the Maldives.
During this visit, you have had discussions with Maldivian ministers, officials, and what were the key priorities, challenges and aspirations expressed by the Maldivian government regarding climate change?
Well, I think it'll be no surprise to your viewers and citizens of the Maldives that your country has been a climate leader globally for many decades. And I think it's one thing to hear and to listen to people talking about the impacts of climate in their country, but to come here and see it firsthand, I think, is what exactly has enabled me, just in this short time already that I've been here, to better understand some of the challenges, but also some of the innovative thinking and opportunities that your government and your citizens are looking at, and your businesses, to help respond to climate challenges, whether that's building more resilience into construction and coastal development, or whether it's the Maldives itself looking to significantly increase the amount of renewable energy that you use.
How do you perceive the role of Maldives as an important global partner for Australia in combating particularly climate change, and what specific collaborative efforts do you envision between the two countries in this regard?
Well, I think, as I mentioned before, just because the Maldives already has a strong and credible voice internationally, it's not something that Australia feels we need to support you to have a louder voice. You already have a very, very loud and credible voice in the international negotiations, and a powerful example from your own country as to why strong global action to reduce emissions matters so much. So we're not in any way trying to support you in that, because you do that in your own right. I think where Australia's seeing an increasing opportunity in working with the Maldives is that, as I mentioned before, we have strong interests in the Pacific, and so the similarities that you have with many Pacific small island nations and atoll nations, and some of the challenges you're dealing with, I think there's opportunities for the Pacific region and the Indian Ocean region, particularly those island states in those regions, to work more closely together. So I think with that context, I'd describe it more as we're looking to facilitate stronger connections with our regions for some of the shared climate challenges that we face.
Can you share any notable observations or experiences you had while you were engaging with technical professionals and grassroots organizers working on the climate change issues in the Maldives?
Well, I think the thing that's really struck me in some of the discussions I've had over the last couple of days is that your country has been thinking about the coastal impacts of climate change for a long time. And in fact, I only found out last night, and I hadn't realised this, that it's not so much sea level rise and the increasing rise of the seas that's the more pressing threat for the Maldives. It's actually the storm surges that come with the sort of more intense ocean movements and tides that are happening as a result of climate change. And so obviously I think there's learnings that Australia can take from the Maldives as to some of the approaches you've been taking for many years to try and manage those. Certainly land reclamation, that's less of an issue in Australia that we have to face. We do have a lot more land obviously than the Maldives, but that coastal erosion and the coastal impacts and the way that oceans and waves behave in the face of a changing climate is, I think, something that we can collaborate on and that we can learn from your experience.
Moving on, considering the environmental challenges faced both by the Maldives and Australia, they have similarities and as well as in contrast there are differences as well. What are the similarities and differences in the approaches to addressing climate change?
Well, perhaps if I start with differences, and I mentioned before, you know, we're a much larger land mass than you are. We are blessed in Australia with an abundance of natural energy resources. So solar, a lot of solar exposure in our country, and lots of land in which we can build large-scale renewable energy installations, such as large solar farms, onshore and offshore wind farms. So I think we're in Australia committed to rapidly transitioning our own energy system from what has been a largely fossil fuel-based energy system for many, many decades to a predominantly renewables-based energy system this decade by 2030. But as I said, we are blessed with lots of land mass to do that. So that's probably one of the key differences to some of the challenges that the Maldives is facing with your own ambitious commitment to increase the proportion of renewables in your energy mix. We had some discussions today with government officials who were asking, well, you've done a lot on renewables, perhaps you can help us. And they'd follow with, we're looking into floating solar in the Maldives. And I said, that's probably not something we can help you with a great deal because we haven't had to look really at floating solar because we have so much land mass. So probably the ways in which we can roll out renewable energy between our two, respectively in our own countries is probably a pretty clear difference. In terms of similarities though, I mentioned coastal impacts before. Perhaps to sort of stick with the coastal theme, I'll touch on coral reefs. Australia has one of the largest coral reefs in the world in the Great Barrier Reef, and of course you also have many coral reefs around your atoll islands. And so some of the discussions that I've been having here are around research between coral scientists, between our two countries that's already happening, and some further research to go around how to build more resilient corals so that with the increasing sea temperatures, the coral bleaching events that we're seeing now and that we know will unfortunately become more frequent, that we have experimentation and then implementation of I guess planting, I'm not sure if that's the correct term, but planting more resilient corals in our coral parts of our nation so that when these bleaching events do happen, there's more chance of the corals surviving those going forward. I certainly don't have to tell you how important coral reefs are to your tourism industry. They're very important to ours, particularly on our Queensland coast where the Great Barrier Reef is. So that's probably an area of similarity that we can work together, learn from each other and implement practices that come from that collaboration.
Could you provide some more detail into the meetings we have held with the government officials and the ministries as well as grassroots level experts as well?
Yeah, so look, because this is certainly my first visit, and if you weren't aware, We only, as Australia, opened our embassy, our High Commission, less than a year ago here in Male. So this is really a sort of set of introductory discussions with a climate focus. So many of the discussions are getting to know some of your key ministers and officials for the first time, from my perspective, understanding their roles and responsibilities within your government. And then I think that starts to open up the conversations that will follow, particularly through our High Commission, on specific areas that we can take forward together. And you started your question in this discussion on, you know, how have I found the reception, and can I just repeat that in all of the engagements I've been happening, whether government or former students that studied in Australia and some of the council representatives we visited as well on one of your atoll islands, everybody has been very enthusiastic about telling me and telling my colleagues about the activities going on around responding to climate change, but also some of the challenges that that the Maldives might need additional assistance with.
From the meetings, what are your main takeaways? Why do you think the Maldives is still struggling with climate change, although we have a strong voice in the international arena?
Well, I think what I didn't take out was that you're struggling any more or any differently than many countries are. You know, all countries are facing the challenge that we are, and the challenges and the impacts affect countries in different ways. But there are also challenges that no single country can solve for themselves. So I think there's a recognition that we all need to work collectively and we all need to do more. And as a wealthy, advanced country, we certainly understand there's an expectation that a country like Australia is taking the lead and doing as much as it can to respond and to support developing countries with climate challenges. So I certainly haven't considered that the Maldives is unique in its challenges, but as a small, low-lying atoll nation, the risks of seawater inundation, sea level rise, of course, have much more significant consequences in time. So I think that's what's behind as well, the powerful voice that you have on the world stage.
How do Australia's priorities in its own climate agenda align with the goals and objectives of the Maldivian government? And you have also highlighted a bit about this, but where do you see potential areas for collaboration or mutual support?
Look, sort of Australia's priorities, as I said, we had a change of government, and so a new government come in just under 2 years ago, and they came in with stronger action on climate change as a key objective. And just to give you a bit of a context of Australia's priorities, some of the very first actions that the government took was to increase our emissions reductions targets for 2030 and legislate that in law, so that it was very clearly a requirement that Australia needs to meet its more ambitious emissions reductions targets. And then looked very closely at where the most important early actions were. And so I mentioned before, we've got a sort of we've got ambitious targets this decade to change from fossil fuel-based energy system to a renewable energy-based energy system this decade. So that's the primary area that the government has taken action and made investments. But even since then, we've moved into looking at our heavy industry that can be quite emissions intensive as well, and now our transport sector. Now, the scale of our energy sector, our industrial sector and our transport sector, of course, will be much larger than the Maldives and have different challenges in the distances we travel or the products we produce. So there's probably not too many direct priorities in terms of our mitigation actions that are transferable between the two countries. It's really more in that adaptation and resilience and coastal development space that I think there's a lot more similarities to work together.
For us in the Maldives, the government and other companies have also been trying to engage the civilians a bit more in the climate change and climate action, and to mostly create awareness among the civilians as well, like phasing out the single-use plastics and empowering people to use alternatives to plastics. What are the key areas that the Maldives can work on in terms of this regard? What more can the Maldives do to phase out single-use plastic, or in terms of projects that we have undertaken?
Look, I think I'd answer that by saying, you know, as a small nation that has to import a lot of its goods, many of the ability to change materials of, you know, we use the example of plastic bags, but I imagine you don't have a large industry that makes bags, whether they're plastic or cloth or alternative materials, and so you do rely on other companies outside of the Maldives to have those options and alternatives available. So it's a more difficult situation in that even though you'd like to make a change, it's not something you can do entirely within your own country. But I think that the voices of the public and being clear on what their expectations are for government, where the government can control those things, but being a powerful voice as consumers. So speaking to the key companies, you know, the drink manufacturers that might produce bottles that are much harder to recycle or use plastic bags. So making clear to your supermarket chains or others what the consumers' expectations are around using more sustainable and recyclable alternatives. Some of your government officials have talked to us today about some introductions of bans on plastic bags, so I know that's something you're thinking about. But some of the discussions we had as well said, you ban one type of plastic bag and then a bag that you never used to use before suddenly gets imported, so that, you know, that's an alternative, but you're not quite sure yet if that's a more sustainable option or not. So I think it's both the combination of understanding what your own government can do, but also what it can't do, and recognising that the voice of people, of the public, can still be powerful in changing industry behaviour as well.
Could you provide insights into any specific programs, initiatives or projects that Australia is considering taking part in to support the Maldives in its effort to mitigate and adapt to the climate change?
Well, maybe I'll start with one that's been a long-standing program between Australia and the Maldives, which is something we call the Australia Awards program. And so this has been running for many decades, but essentially what it does is it provides university scholarships for Maldivian citizens to study at Australian universities. That program, as I said, has been running for many decades, but what is becoming much more apparent in more recent years is the number of students that are coming to study courses and degrees that are relevant for climate and environment outcomes is really increasing. And so I think that's a program that we're very proud of in Australia, and in fact I just came from an iftar dinner where we hosted around 30 alumni of that program who are all working in various fields of climate and environment and sustainability. And so hearing about the experiences they had studying in Australia, beyond just the academic learning, of course, the cultural connections and people-to-people linkages that makes is extremely important. But taking the academic learning back here into the jobs that they have in business, in government, in NGOs and civil society, and putting those learnings but also those passions and commitments to taking stronger action on climate was really quite breathtaking. So I know you asked about what future activities, but I see that as a really important ongoing activity where I would expect there's just increasing benefits for that collaboration and learning on climate change. Perhaps another example that I've just learned about since I've been here as well. Both our countries, of course, have mangroves because we have coastlines. I can't remember the exact statistics, but I do remember hearing a little while ago that mangroves are much more important for the climate than trees on land because they grow quickly, they sequester more carbon. I think it's around 4 times as much carbon as a tree on land. And so that's very good for, you know, drawing down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. But they have significant additional benefits such as restoring fisheries habitats, which is of course important for the marine species, but important for economic empowerment of local communities that might gain an income from fishing. So there is a recent project that's just been launched where Australia and the Maldives are working on restoring and planting mangroves in areas off the shore here in the Maldives, in areas where the mangroves wouldn't grow naturally themselves because the currents and the salt water is too strong. But by planting these in these little cement pods, sort of cement planters that go down onto the sea floor, and then the new sapling for the mangrove is planted in that, so it's protected as it's growing up, and then when its roots are strong enough, they go down into the sea floor. So it's experimenting with rehabilitating and planting new mangroves in areas that they wouldn't be able to grow themselves. And in addition to the mangroves and the benefits that I talked about then, these sort of cement pods that they're planted in, and then as they grow up, the mangroves themselves act as seawalls, and they slow the speed of the waves that are coming in to hit the coastline in the Maldives. And as I'm sure you know, it's and I mentioned before, it's actually the coastal erosion and the impact of the more powerful waves that is a bigger problem through climate change at the moment than sea level rise. So this is, I think, an area of ongoing and future collaboration between our countries.
What do you consider to be key lessons or best practices that Australia can learn from the Maldives in terms of climate change resilience and adaptation strategies?
We've talked a lot about coastal adaptation and resilience, but I have to reiterate that that's probably the area that you have so much coastline and so much experience, and you've been trialling different approaches for decades in some cases. And so I think all island countries, Australia is obviously a much bigger island country, but an island country nonetheless, has an important opportunity to learn from the Maldives. I think as well we'll increasingly start seeing the impact of warming oceans on fish stocks and the migration patterns of sea species, so sharks and others that might move in different parts of the ocean given the warming temperatures. And so I think we can learn a lot from the ongoing research and science that will be happening in the Maldives to apply it not only in our own country, but as I said, in the work we do in the Pacific as well.
Looking ahead, what are your thoughts on the next steps in strengthening the partnership between Australia and the Maldives in addressing the shared challenges posed by the climate change?
Well, I think, as I mentioned before, we've only just opened our High Commission here, and so the sort of bilateral engagement is new, and I think we're still listening, learning and understanding each other's priorities such that we can identify the right areas to collaborate bilaterally going forward. But I think it's important to look at the number of international and regional forums that both our countries participate. So obviously the large UN climate conferences. We're not in the same sort of country groupings, but we often have similar views and positions that we take. And so I think there's a great opportunity for us to collaborate more closely in those international forums. And of course, we're both members of the Commonwealth of Nations, and we have the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Samoa coming up later this year. So I think representing the importance of strong climate action and adaptation and resilience building at those meetings is a great opportunity.
If you were to give one free advice to the viewers about how you can contribute, how they can contribute to climate change and to mitigate the effects of climate change, what would be your advice?
Well, I think it's interesting in that the challenge can seem so big that sometimes people feel that individual actions won't make a difference. I have a different view. I think individual actions are vitally important. Of course, business and government have a very important role to play, but what I find in my own practice, but certainly when I talk to others, is that it's when you start taking individual actions that you pay a bit more attention and you read up a little bit more about what real changes and actions can make a much more impactful difference. And it's with that knowledge that you're able to talk more directly to governments and business about what it is you'd like to see them do. So individual actions really important in your own way, and for each person that might be looking at cycling some of the trips that you take instead of driving, not leaving lights on when you don't need to. Those simple things, they're not going to change the world, but they just start a practice and a habit that makes you think more broadly and widely and put your views to those that do have real power.
Something so small, one action so small could have a huge impact, right?
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for sitting with us and sharing some insights into this topic, which is of of crucial importance to the Maldives and Australia as well. We look forward to hearing more about the collaboration between the Maldives and Australia in terms of climate change and in terms of actions that both countries are willing to take. Thank you once again for sitting with us.
Wonderful. Thanks for having me, and I look forward to coming back.
Thank you so much. And that concludes this episode of 750. Hoping to see you again next time. Goodbye.